The topic that we're studying is the image of God in man, the image of God in man. And each year I teach the Pentateuch class here at Masters Baptist College, and this is one of the first things that we run into is this image of God in man. And what does it mean? I put a verse here from Psalm chapter 8, verse 4 at the top that says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him?" What is man? It's a question that we ought to ask. How does the Bible define man? And certainly this concept of the image of God being in man is one of the ways that we can answer that. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray that as we take a look into your word and we study out this amazing concept, and what a blessing to see what you've done in our lives, I pray that as we look into it, that you'll help us to be attentive and to gather something from this that will affect our lives. Will change the way that we look at ourselves and at others. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, of course, the key passage as we come to this subject is right there at the beginning of the Bible. And I have it printed on the page here. So take a look. Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 through 28. "And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good." You're going to notice a pretty quick contrast here. There's something repeated again and again here in this passage. The living creature after his kind, beast of the earth after his kind, after his kind, after their kind. But then, verse 26, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." So in creation, when God created all things, we see that he made the animal kinds. And if you hear a sermon about creation, doubtless somebody will delve into everything that's involved with that. After his kind, after his kind. But we see that something is different. For humanity, we're not made after an animal kind. We're made after the likeness of God, after the image of God. What an amazing thing. What a different thing than what the world tends to think about humanity. That, we're just the human animal. But that is not the way that the Bible presents things. Notice verse 27, I have it highlighted in blue. Man here, God created man in his own image. This refers to mankind, or humanity might be the terms that we're referring to here. You can see God created man in his own image, and it says, male and female created he them. So this term man, being in the image of God, refers to men and women. The image of God is something that applies to men and women. And also, we do have an initial hint in this passage about something, one piece at least, related to what's being spoken of. There in verse number 28, it says that God told mankind to subdue it and have dominion over everything that's in the earth there. So an initial hint about what makes humanity different from the animals is this dominion mandate, as it's often called. And that is one of the things that we look at when we look at the question of the image of God in man, is what makes us different from the animals, or even from the angels. And of course the question also comes in, well, if we're made in the image of God, but what still makes us different from God as well? And these are some of the things that we'll try to answer. But the first thing that we need to do is ask this question, which I think a lot of times people might just come to the first thing that they think of, and they say, well, the image of God is a physical reality. So is the image of God a physical reality? The word image and the underlying Hebrew word, selem, can be used to refer to a physical representation of someone. And so an example of that from the Old Testament here in 2 Kings, "And all the people of the land went into the house of Baal, and brake it down, his altars and his images brake they in pieces thoroughly." So the image of Baal in this case is a physical representation of the god, the false god Baal. And of course, pretty much all of the nations have had physical images that they've made of their gods. So is that what's being spoken of when we learn that the image of God, that we are made in the image of God? Does it mean that I am shaped the way that God is shaped, that my physical body is a copy of some physical body, or at least bodily shape in heaven? I think there's several serious problems with this view. So let's take a look at a few of these problems. Number one, God is a spirit. Now, kind of an advanced word, but it's a really useful one, is the word ontology, or talking about something's ontological nature. It means what it really is at the base level. For example, we talk about the spirit. God is a spirit, angels have spirits, humans have spirits and such. But ontologically, we are not the same kind of spirit that God is. We're not the same kind of creature. Mormonism says that we are also the same kind of creature, but God, his spirit is different from ours. Our ontology is human. God's ontology is God. That is what he consists of. You have to be careful not to necessarily say made of, because he's never been made. But he's a spirit. John 4:24, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And a spirit is not made of matter. This is one of the ways that we can even talk about the eternal existence of God, is that the spirit's not made of matter. It doesn't decay like matter does. There's a lot of problems with hypothesizing an infinitely long existing universe into the past, but it doesn't apply to spirit because spirit is not matter. It's not subject to the laws of nature. And so God is a spirit. He does not have a body, except, of course, we must clarify that at a point in time, God took on a body, the time of the incarnation. God became flesh, but that is not his ontological nature as it began. Christ does not have a human body because that's just the way he is. There's an eternal body. It's something he willingly took on. And now Christ does have that additional ontology added on to the God nature, human nature and God nature. So there's a problem there with saying, well, we're made in this shape because God has that shape, because God's a spirit. Spirits don't have a shape, right? They're, in fact, in one sense, extremely simple. They're not made of parts at all. And that'll come up again in a moment. Another one is that God is omnipresent. Jeremiah 23:23-24 says, Am I a God at hand, saith the Lord, and not a God afar off? Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him, saith the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? So God is not limited to a particular location with a body, with a shape. God can, of course, make a visible presence of himself, and as he chooses to do so, we find that he does so through Jesus Christ. The second person of the Trinity is the one who appears. He's the image of the invisible God. Number 3, God is uncreated. Psalm 90, verse 2, Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. A strong argument that we can use to explain why we do not believe that humanity just came about without any intelligence is that when you look at the human body, you see many evidences of design. You look at the eye, that's a common one to mention, but I mean, just look at the digestive system, or look at the DNA, the cells, look at the way that anything works. If you dig in far enough, you'll say, this is absolutely amazing. This evidence is design. But if God has a body, and we're made after his body, then of course the question follows, well, okay, so God didn't actually design the body. He has a body, and who designed God's body? But that's a mistake. God designed the body, all right? We're not bodily because it's a copy of God's body. So this, again, is another problem with the idea of the image of God, meaning that we have a shape that God has. No, God invented the human shape, and that's really what this fourth point is. The human shape has purpose. Psalm 139, 13-14 says, For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You know, why do I have 10 fingers on my hands? Well, because God has made the earth, and he has made me, and for me to live my life here on this earth, for me to do the things he's called me to do, to till the ground and such, it's extremely useful. in this terrain to have these fingers to be able to manipulate things? Why do I have a digestive system? Because I eat the food that grows on the earth that God made, and God made the earth and he made me, and he knows that a digestive system will work in this world. Why do I have eyes? To see here in this planet where there's oxygen in the air and nitrogen and such. This eye wouldn't work necessarily in any given scenario, but it works for the way that God has made me. My shape has purpose. Now, if God has that shape, it's completely purposeless for God. The shape is meant because God made me for the earth. If God has a digestive system, what's the point? If he doesn't eat enough food, he's going to die? No, that's nonsensical, right? So obviously the shape is something God created. The image of God cannot be referring to me having the shape that comes from God. And one final point on this is that Christ took on human form, not vice versa. Philippians 2:5-8 says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men." Notice that similarity there, even from that to what we saw back in Genesis 1, where let's make them in our likeness. Now Christ says he was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Christ he took the form of a servant. He was made in the likeness of men. So in that sense, we are talking about a physical reality. Christ actually did take on human shape, but it's not like Christ was taking back on the shape that he already had because God has that shape, right? No, God invented the body, and now, for the first time, he enters that body completely in an ontological way, though he has appeared in the past as a human in many cases, but now he actually becomes a man. It's not the other way around, that God gets back into the shape of God as he's been before. And so those are 5 arguments why I don't think that we can be talking about a physical reality when we're talking about the image of God. So what are we talking about? Well, on page 2, we're going to look at this in 2 different ways. First, what it means to be made in God's image, and second, what comes with being made in God's image. Because there are some things that I believe come with being in the image of God that may not definitionally be the image of God. We'll do our best to try to separate these out. What it means to be made in God's image? Well, one thing is an immortal soul, an immortal soul. Now, God, of course, he has immortality from beginning to end. He's existed infinitely into the past and beyond the past and infinitely forward. We are not that way. We only go one direction. We do have a starting point, but after that, there is an eternal existence for every person. The biblical concepts of life and death, they're different from secular society's view. And we're told in the Bible that all people will be conscious forever. Only the saved have eternal life, which tells us that what life means and what death means is different in Christianity than what just the world understands. And Christ had to explain this a few times. He explained it to Martha in the New Testament, one of the best places where we hear that. But notice this in Matthew 25:46. He says, "And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal." There's 2 classes of humanity that Christ mentions here, and both of them have something that goes on forever. Everlasting punishment or life eternal. There will be eternal existence. So there is a soul that will continue forever. And even a person physically living that does not have Jesus doesn't have real spiritual life. You notice this in 1 John 5:12. "He that hath the Son hath life. He that hath not the Son of God hath not life." So if you are physically alive, but you don't have the Son of God, you don't really have life. And this can explain how some people who have questioned the doctrine of eternal conscious torment have said, well, we don't believe everybody has eternal life. Well, neither do I. In fact, there are many people who have physical life right now who are actually dead, spiritually dead, right? So it does not speak only of existence. Life is more than simple existence in the human, in God's understanding. Though animals and humans both share the same fate of physical death, there is, though, a difference in what happens to the immaterial part of man and what happens to an animal. And this is where you can really start to separate this image of God and man out from the animals. Notice in Ecclesiastes 3, verses 19 through 21, "For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. So at that point, it's like, yeah, we're no better than the animals. But then notice what it goes on to say. All go again to one place, all are the dust, all turn to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth? Now, it's an open question, I would say, whether God has any plan for animals in heaven. But he could recreate, he can do all those kind of things. There's no expectation that a soul of an animal that lives on earth today, that we will see that soul in eternity. It goes downward to the earth. But God is the great creator, right? And so in heaven, who knows what he may have planned for us as far as if the animal kinds will continue or be remade. Another thing that it means to be made in God's image is that we are designed for a personal relationship. And we're designed, I believe, for both a personal relationship with God, but also for personal relationships with each other. When God formed Adam, Adam desired someone like him to have a relationship with. You remember this story. God designs Adam. Adam looks around, and he says, I see that the beasts, they're in pairs, 2 and 2, and a male and a female, and here I am, and there's nobody there to be with me. And it's interesting to note that we also find throughout eternity, God has always existed, and at a time in history, he said, I want to make somebody in my image. God wanted to have somebody after his likeness that he could share a personal relationship with. And so, he created this whole universe, he created this world, and he created humanity. 1 John 5:20 says, And we know that the Son of God is come, and hath given us an understanding that we may know him that is true. And we are in him that is true, even in his Son Jesus Christ. This is the true God and eternal life. Now, people and animals, they can make close emotional connections. I think in both directions. I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who's had a dog, for example, that they've got very close with, that there is some kind of an emotional connection there. But with animals not having the benefits of fully being able to understand human language, they can respond to just a sounds that they hear. They may eventually come to know the sound of the food bowl clanking or even you saying certain things. But they can't understand complex concepts of language. The depth of that relationship, any person who's had a child will certainly know that the depth of a relationship with an animal is capped at a very low point compared to how things can go with your relationship with your own child and, of course, with a spouse or even with a friend. And so it cannot really be said that in a full understanding of relationship that humanity and animals can have a personal relationship. But humankind can, both with each other and with our Creator. So we are designed for personal relationship. Another thing is that we have the ability to make free choices. God calls on us to make certain decisions, and he holds us accountable for whether or not we do that. God has not held, you'll notice, the animals to similar account. God does give allowance, even in the Old Testament, for putting animals to death in certain cases, but those kind of things have been handled in quite different ways. We really don't view generally an animal as having the same kind of moral responsibility as a human does. And if an animal kills a person, often they'll put that animal to death. But it's not because we per se say that animal sinned or did wrong. In fact, if you train a dog, you can train a dog to be a police dog. And that dog will go and he'll bite the criminal. And we'll say that's a moral good. But a drug cartel could also train the same dog to go and bite the police. And we'd say that's a moral bad. Well, the dog, he knows if he's done his job, he's done the right thing either way. He has no consideration whether it's actually a moral good or a moral wrong. He just knows whether he's pleased his master. But we're different than that. We have the ability to make free choices. In Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. We can choose, and we can choose even based on moral decisions, as you'll see in the next point. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, according that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. I think we all inherently recognize that humanity has a moral ability to choose between two decisions. There are those who, even based on theological argument, try to argue the opposite. But when somebody breaks into your home, you want that person held to account, as if they had any choice in the matter to do so. Our whole legal system is built on the idea that humans, in fact, can choose whether to do right or wrong, and that they should be held to account for the choices they make. And it's the same thing we see in the Bible about the final judgment. God will one day judge us for whether we have done right or wrong, the implication being that we could have chosen to do either right or wrong. But we also have this built-in moral compass. God put within us, within humanity, a recognition of certain moral truths. And in a moment, we're going to talk about the ways that these can go wrong. But let us recognize at least that God has given us some understanding of moral things even before, or even if a person never does read the Bible, there are certain things that they come to that are nearly universal to humanity, certain moral truths. Notice the passage here, Romans chapter 2. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, so when writing this, Paul is speaking of people who didn't have the Old Testament, these other nations, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves. Notice this, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile, accusing or else excusing one another. What does that mean at the end there? A person who's never read the Bible, never been confronted with biblical truth, they still accuse or excuse each other. They see two people who haven't ever read the Bible, somebody in a tribe somewhere who's disconnected from modern society, but they see that man do something. They either accuse him or they excuse him. They say, oh, that's okay. Or they say, he shouldn't have done that. Why? Why do we have this understanding? Why? The animals don't do things the same way. They'll often recognize maybe some slight against themselves, but they're not evaluating every other decision like humanity is. It can even be problematic, as was mentioned in the sermon this morning, where people start investigating everything everybody else does, but that's human nature. We look at the decisions other people make and we either accuse them or we excuse them. That's because God has written a law in our hearts. He's given us an inbuilt moral understanding. It does have limits, but it does mean that people, and often, if you look at society today, they'll argue, doesn't matter if you're an atheist, doesn't matter if you're a Christian, just look at politics and people will say, this decision is moral or this one's immoral. And most all arguments are based on the morality statement. You take the question of whether or not the United States should have universal health care. Although people on one side, they'll say, well, that's immoral because it requires taking money from somebody and giving it to somebody else, and we believe it's theft. And the other side will say it's immoral not to because it means allowing people to not have access to health care and dying before they should when somebody else could just help them. Both sides use a moral argument to do it, even if they don't care about what the Bible has to say. Their argument is based on a concept of morality. And the atheists will like to say, well, morality is a construct, it's just a thing that we've come up with, or it's part of human evolution, they'll say. But the reality is, they can't explain morality because it's given to us by God. Yes, everybody can come together and agree on certain moral things, although the number of things everybody agrees on seems to be getting less and less as humanity continues through time. But the reason we can agree on some things is not just because we kind of just got this out of nowhere. It's because God put that there. God put that moral understanding. And even the atheist appeals to something that we all know, except he doesn't want to admit who made us know it, which is God. So we have a built-in moral compass. And we also have knowledge of the Creator. Romans 1:19 through 20, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. That person who has never read the Bible will not be with an excuse on Judgment Day and say, oh, I didn't know, because God has put a knowledge of the Creator in all of us. And if the person will seek God, God will reveal himself to them in some way or another. Now, on page 3, we're going to look at some things that I believe come with being made in God's image. One of them is intelligent reasoning. Job chapter 35, verses 10 through 11, God my Maker, who teacheth us more than the beasts of the earth, and maketh us wiser than the fowls of heaven. I think it goes without saying. It's an obvious fact to all of us that humanity can reason through things, complex understanding. We can make a chain of logic, and the animals, they can't follow along that same way. Creative power is another one. I put an image there of one of the recent space exploration tools that mankind has constructed. But there's been all kinds of things throughout history, and we see it the most maybe in modern technology. Exodus 31, I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship to devise cunning works, to work in gold and silver and in brass and in cutting of stones to set them and carving of timber, to work in all manner of workmanship. You know, you can see an animal, they have a very limited ability to create. People say, oh, look at this particular wasp that can make this amazing nest. And look at this other animal that, a gopher can go and build a dam and things like that. And anthills can be pretty amazing. But they're pretty limited, right? There's an area of built-in instinct that they have, and beyond that, that's really where it stops. But God has given humanity creative power. And what I love about this is, of course, we think of God, the image of God in man. God is the creator, and he created all of us. And when he created us in his image, he also gave us creative power so we too can create things. And it's been very fulfilling to many people in their lives to be able to be part of that. Maybe connected to this is the idea of diverse skill sets. Ecclesiastes 9:10 says, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. So again, the animals can be taught to do certain things, but there's definitely limits where it can only go so far. But you just set some humans loose, and it's not like everybody follows the same instinct and goes and does the same thing. Like every bee goes and starts being a part of the building the all of their nests and building the honeycomb, or maybe one of the bees is the queen bee and such, but it's the same way. Every time you set off a queen bee, starts another hive, it's the same story time and time again. You send 50 people 50 different ways, and you may end up with some of the things pictured here. There are those who become a firefighter, and that's their calling. There's others who are auto mechanics or farmers. Or even this final picture here is an example of sports, and this is fencing being done by folks who actually have a disability, but they're still involved and jumping in and doing something very diverse and very different and unexpected, and that you wouldn't find in the animal kingdom. These diverse skill sets reflect the diversity found within God, who, of course, has all power. Then we have dominion over creation. This is something that comes with being made in God's image. Genesis 1:28 said, we read it earlier, God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. I gave some examples here at the bottom. The first one's a dam. We stop up the hydroelectric. We build a hydroelectric dam, we stop up the water, we allow it through at certain rates, it goes through turbines, it produces electricity. Dominion over creation, even over the water cycle. The next one is an animal in a zoo. We take these powerful, the lion. What could be a more powerful example of a strong animal than that? You put a lion and a human together, it's generally not going to go well for the human. But yet, there you don't find lions having humans in the zoo. You find humans having lions in the zoo, right? We have dominion over creation. And the next one maybe makes it even more plain, because there's a steak or a meal that's not vegetarian, right? Dominion over creation, we even find it morally acceptable, and the Bible teaches it as morally acceptable, that we can even consume the animals, but yet we cannot do the same thing for humanity. Then we have drugs, which have helped many people's lives. In fact, I even took some painkillers today, just some Tylenol, because I had a headache, and it makes our lives better. That's dominion over creation. God, he built the human body. He also sent a curse, which caused things like pain, but he also built into this world all of these various chemicals that we have come to discover that can be used to, I've had a lot of dental work done, and I've seen a few things about how that kind of thing used to happen in the 1700s, and I sure am glad I don't live in that age. That is the real horror story, reading about dentistry in the past. It's so much better now, and so we're thankful for pharmaceuticals. Another idea of dominion over creation, or a rock climber here, just being able to conquer the most difficult parts of the world that God has given us. Those are all ways that we exercise that dominion. But with the rest of our time, let's take a look now at the implications of being made in God's image. So if we are in God's image, what does it really mean for us? So these are some examples of just what it is. That's the what. Now let's talk about some of the why questions or the how questions following it. One of the big things is that humans have intrinsic value. If you look at the news or if you just read social media, you'll begin to get a picture that the world doesn't ultimately, at least not unless they're trying to put on a particular good face, view humans as having the same intrinsic value. The people who are valuable to the world are people like an actress or a president or an engineer or a nurse, and of course, they are valuable. But not so valuable to the world are the homeless or the criminal or the unwanted unborn child or the terminally ill person or the person with opposite political beliefs or the person with the wrong religious beliefs or the primitive person who's kind of living life without the advances of modern society. They put different value on people for those things. But we don't have that same understanding. We should not have that same understanding as Christians because we understand that all of humanity was made in the image of God. So without God, what makes a person valuable is what they can bring to society. And so, of course, the idea of an unborn child that's unwanted or a person with the wrong religious beliefs who's going to, their religious beliefs are going to hold society back. That's how society views things, and it's not the way that we should view things. Matthew 25, to look to the New Testament to see a similar thing. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. God looks on those that he has created as his images, as the image of God, and he cares about the way that we treat the other images of God. And when I say differing religious beliefs, I don't just speak of the fact that society today doesn't have the same view of Christianity as it used to in the past. I speak of our belief today even toward those of other religions, those who are Muslim, those even radical Muslim, right? Still made in the image of God. And so our ultimate thought should not be, ultimately the thought should be is how can we reach these people? How can we take this image of God and ensure that they have eternal life? And so we need to be very careful in the way that we treat and understand people based on their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, because these are all people made in God's image that he cares about the way that we understand and the things that we want for those people. Another thing that is often overlooked quite a bit or put in a completely wrong frame is that because we are made in God's image, human rights exist. Rights are not scientific facts. We cannot discover them. Rights require somebody who gave them. And the secular world really likes to talk and clamor about all number of human rights, but there's no basis for that. Who says that a human has rights? Why not? If it advances me, if it allows me to have what I want, I'll do it that way, whether or not it does anything good for you. What is your moral framework by which you can charge me with being wrong and you with being right and me having to treat any human differently? It requires a lawgiver. You may say, well, the government says so. Yes, but we can overthrow the government. We can find that their argument is not absolute, is it? Notice this from the Declaration of Independence. You've probably heard this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a lot of modern secular society would love to retain the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness while throwing out the part about the Creator, but you can't do it that way. You cannot have rights without somebody who grants those rights. The Bible mentions a right to life and justice if the right is violated. In Genesis 9:6, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. We may not murder, because to murder is to extinguish another image of God, and God has not given us the right to do that. Nevertheless, he has given the right in cases where that does happen. It's not the same for a murderer to be executed as an innocent person to be killed by a murderer. God does recognize those as two different things. And so somebody who does wrongfully take life has forfeited their right to life. And even the Bible talks about a right to private property. You see in Ephesians 2:8, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor. Well, if there's no private property, there's no theft, right? The fact that you can steal from the neighbor or not steal means that the neighbor actually owns the things in his possession and that you do not have the right to take them freely. Another implication is that humanity was created. The image of God and man, it's not something that God gave to a lower form of life. We say God made man in his image. He didn't give it to a lower form of life that slowly evolved into humanity. God gave it directly to man at creation. And so this fact that we have the image of God, it makes nonsense of the idea of human evolution. Because if humanity evolved, does God then insert his image into a being that already existed millions of years before? Or did God give the very first single-celled amoeba the image? No, it doesn't work. God created man, and when he created man, he was created in God's image. Letter D, humanity is unique. Humans are not just the most advanced among the animals, as Darwinism proposes. Man is a unique creature, more like God than he's like the animals. Genesis 9:3, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. Now, an argument that you might encounter more today is this interesting situation of artificial intelligence, particularly these AI chatbots that have come out in the last few years. And somebody might say, artificial intelligence chatbots, they have the image of God too, and they can imitate human thinking and consciousness, but they are not the image of God. Now, secular ethicists have a problem, and I've listened to some of the top minds argue this, and generally they'll say, we don't think that they're conscious yet, but we think that they could become conscious, that there will be AI that's actually conscious. And the question is, why are we not allowed to kill a human? But we can unplug the AI chatbot. Nobody really has any qualms right now, or it's even a little bit disrespectful after he's answered the question to just turn the phone off, right? I mean, without even a thank you. And you're not supposed to say thank you because that uses up extra compute. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do there. But the reality is we realize we're not talking to something that's actually intelligent. We're not talking to something that really has a soul, and that's the root of the matter here. You can see it's a little hard to read perhaps, but a couple articles that I just snipped the headlines. Do chatbots have rights? And the San Francisco Standard, civil rights for AI. These questions are coming up, but the reality is that these chatbots never have a soul. They don't have the image of God. And so they can do some interesting and useful things, but there is still a uniqueness about humanity because of our soul that can only be imitated but never actually copied. On page 5, human life has purpose. If we're simply advanced animals, there's no reason to value life. Eat, drink, and be merry. But we are more than that. Revelation 4:11, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. So let's apply this image of God to some moral issues. To idolatry, God has already made an image of himself. That's what we've been talking about. God made the image of himself. We are the image of God. So for us to make another image can never meet the standard God has set. This is why we may not make any image of God. Do you think you really can do a better job than God has already done? Exodus 24, of course, from the Ten Commandments. Slavery. Man stealing is prohibited in part because it disrespects the free will that God has given humanity in his image. In Deuteronomy 24:7, if a man be found stealing any of his brethren of the children of Israel and maketh merchandise of him or selleth him, then that thief shall die. You're taking away one of those things that comes with being made in the image of God. Or suicide, taking one's own life, again, assumes that one has the right to it, but we're made in the image of God. God has the right to decide then when life ends. It's a crime against God to remove one of his images, and you are one of them. And, of course, 1 Corinthians says of the believer, your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which you have in you, which is in you, which you have of God, and ye are not your own. And so we don't really have the right to take life in that way. And, of course, in giving, in many different ways. Why should I really give blood? Why might I consider being an organ donor? Or why give money or volunteer time? One day in heaven when God rewards things, He will. And we even read the passage about, you did these things to me or you did these things not to me. Giving blood, you gave that to another image of God. You did not just give that to another person. It's just another human, it's just another guy, it's just another American or whoever. No, that was to another image of God that you provided that blood, or that you donated that organ, or that you volunteered your time. And so understanding that these are all images of God that we're surrounded with should help change our perspective on these moral issues. I'm out of time, but I'll keep going for a little bit longer to quickly go through these last points. The marring of the image of God. Now, there's no doubt about it. The fall disrupted some things as far as this image goes. Genesis 3, the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And the serpent actually overlooks in this statement, when he says, you're going to be as gods, the fact that they already are, in some sense, as God, right? They were created in the image of God. And so there's a bit of something being misstated there. In reality, because of sin, humanity became less like God. And now they knew sin by experience. And this resulting curse brought additional imperfections on their being. It separated them from God. Now, how is it marred, the image of God? Here are the same points we looked at earlier. We mentioned the immortal soul. Before, humanity did have an immortal body, but now they would die. And we read about that in those two verses listed there. On the back page, we're designed for personal relationship. That's part of the image of God in man. But not only now after the curse could humanity and God no longer get along, but humans couldn't get along among themselves. You can see in Genesis 3:10, Adam can't get along with God as well as he could before. And in Genesis 11:9, we find that God reaches down and interferes with humanity's relationship there. And it's another problem because of the curse that results in these relationships between even nations today. Another thing is the ability to make free choices. You say, well, I have free will. But our sin nature has strongly affected this free will. It causes us to do things that we don't at the deepest level even want to do. Romans 7, Paul says, For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that I do. And so ultimately, though we are responsible for our decisions, we have this sin nature that is interfering with our ability to actually do what we at our deepest level want to do. And then we have a built-in moral compass, but our consciences, as we can see, can become defiled, and we believe right to be wrong and wrong to be right. A final point, which I think is very important to understand in this, is the idea of the image of God, the ultimate image of God, and ultimately our conformity to it. The ultimate image of God is Jesus Christ. And I think this is quite interesting. Notice this in 2 Corinthians 4:4. In whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, and that's speaking of the devil, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. We are made in the image of God, but Christ is the image of God. And you see that again in Colossians 1:15, who Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. Hebrews 1:3, the express image of his person. So ultimately, the ultimate image of God is seen through Jesus Christ. And though we, as humans, as sinners now, because of the curse, do not demonstrate that image as we should, we do not properly reflect that image, Christ does, and by looking to him, we can be conformed into the image that we were made to be. And this is the number 8 here, the renewal of the image of God. How can we as images of God be renewed into properly showing what we truly are? Salvation results in a conforming to God's image. Romans 8:29, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. And so if you are a believer tonight, if you are a believer, God has predestinated that you would be conformed into the image of his Son, that you would take back on some of the things that were lost due to the fall. Colossians 3:9 through 10, lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. And so we can be renewed to better display that image of God. One day, we will all perfectly be renewed in the image of God in glory. 1 John 3:2 says, Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him. And him is speaking of the image of God, Jesus Christ, for we shall see him as he is. 1 Corinthians says, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly, and we shall be changed. So one day, although in this life we should be striving ever more through obedience to Christ and through holiness to be like Jesus Christ, we'll never be able to perfectly attain it until one day we will in glory with God. And so my charge to you tonight is that in anticipation of that day, let us look to Jesus and be conformed to his image. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, But we all with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image, from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. So this is to be Christ-like, is to be sanctified, is to treat other images of God as Christ treated them. And it is a high calling. So remember who everyone else around you really is. Remember who they are. Remember when you encounter each person that you're encountering an image of God. Remember who you are. And remember who you ought to be.